Hey, what is going on, guys? This is another edition of the Des and Will Show Weekend Edition with your host, Evan Cheney. Today, I am joined by a special friend of mine. I do some other work with him outside of this podcast. It's Matt Jones. How you doing today, Matt?
Not too bad, man. It's almost August. I'm getting all the updates on Twitter about training camp. I'm ready to rock now.
Dude, I saw Carson Wentz. He was just walking out there, having a good old time. I was so happy.
Did you see the one tweet where the beat reporter was like, "I know it's only stretches, but if it wasn't for the brace on his leg, you could never tell he had a catastrophic injury." I was like, "What does that even mean?" That's late July.
I was gonna say that's
Twitter for you.
Yeah, it's July 26th football Twitter, and then everything that happened last night. I don't know if you saw that
with Davis.
Yeah,
it was unbelievable. That was the happiest I've ever been scrolling through a Twitter argument.
That was a fun time. Anyway, we are here to have another discussion about best ball. If you guys didn't listen to the previous podcast I did on best ball, you can go check that back out. Come back here. We'll, of course, accept you. But yeah, this is just for a little bit more of an in-depth discussion about strategy and other things to look at for best ball drafts for someone that is much more knowledgeable on the topic than I am. So Matt, kind of dive in, kind of talk about, what you do in best ball drafts and what you recommend other people doing, like when they're going into like draft.com, trying to participate in the best ball championship, for example.
Yeah, I mean, for draft contests, I've been probably doing them since, I don't know, maybe like Memorial Day-ish. Like I've been trying to get in a little early and see, if there's some values that I think pop up. But for the most part, what I've been doing is I've been taking it draft by draft and deciding what I'm going to do based on my draft position. So like when I've been in the beginning of drafts, I've been taking one of the running backs. When I've been at the end of drafts, I've sort of been going more towards zero RB, which is a little bit more of my comfort zone. That's what I kind of like doing in redraft generally, but it's kind of hard if you have one of the first three picks to stray from the running backs, in my opinion, unless you're going to go like Antonio Brown, which I've done a little bit of, but yeah, I've been trying to stick to because I think eight running backs are going in the first round as of right now. So like it's almost impossible if you're picking in the beginning and you have to wait for it to come all the way back around. Like if you're not taking a running back, it's utter trash for your RB1 when it comes back to you. So that's sort of how I've been viewing drafts at the beginning.
Okay. So yeah, for some of the people that haven't been kind of like digesting all this stuff prior, can you explain to the audience kind of what the zero running back strategy is?
Yeah, so zero running back is just a one sort of like structure strategy that you can use in your drafts. It was extremely successful a couple years ago. I guess it was 2015 that it was probably the most successful. But it's basically just means that the first, say, 5, 6 rounds, you're not picking a running back, and you're waiting and relying on either injuries, and you're picking sort of satellite backs and pass catching backs that have some value, especially in PPR, but might not be like the quote unquote workhorse. And it's been pretty successful overall. I think that obviously last year we saw running back production go way up. We avoided a lot of injuries to the running back position. The only real issue was probably Zeke being suspended. But zero RB is just you're loading up on targets. You're loading up on hopefully upside if you're picking the right guys, and just figuring out running back later in the year through the waiver wire if you're talking about a redraft league. But for best ball, obviously that's not an option, so you have to sort of take that into account as well.
Okay. So next thing, I'm kind of just gonna beat everything down here very quickly. So okay, So just go down or go through a draft, a best ball draft process yourself, right? If you're drafting, I'll just go into the different segments, right? So let's say, you're drafting 1 to 3, 4 to 6, so on and so forth, right? What position are you drafting, say, first to third overall pick versus fourth to six, 7 to 9, and then 10 to 12?
Yeah, so like I said, in the beginning, if I'm one of the first 3 picks, I'm 90% of the time drafting either Gurley, Bell, or DJ. Given the Bell stuff, that could sort of change since he's a little discontent with his current contract situation, to say the least.
I mean, I would be too if I'm seeing dudes worse than me earning 45 million or something.
Yeah,
all that. Yeah, nah, I'd be pissed too.
So I mean that's definitely one way to go. Once I get past those 3, especially in draft, considering that it's PPR, I am very tempted to take Antonio Brown. So if I'm like 4, 5, 6, and those running backs have gone, I'm definitely going for Brown. Then drafts can go a lot of different ways once you get past 6. I think almost every draft that I've been in has been Gurley, Bell, DJ, Zeke, Antonio Brown, and then it starts to zig depending on who's in the draft room with you. So like I said, if I'm at the end, if I'm like 10 to 12, I'm more than happy to like OBJ has been slipping down there. Like you can get Julio, depending on how crazy running backs go. You could even get like a Hopkins back there. And then that's when I go 0 RB. I end up getting, Hopkins and Julio or OBJ and Michael Thomas or Keenan Allen. Like that's when the decision is made for me, what I'm going to sort of do with the draft.
Okay. So, I mean, obviously you talked about, if you have a top 3 pick, you're obviously going to go Gurley, Johnson, Bell, right? But then if if you're slipping to 4 to 6, right? Obviously you have your position choices. Let's just go a little bit more specific, right? Player-wise, right? Down to the specific player. Do you have, do you make a list in these drafts and say, like, just like a season-long draft, to say, if I'm picking here, and I'm picking wide receiver, I'm picking these guys, this guy, and this guy, right? Do you have that list? And if you do, who's kind of on that radar?
Yeah, I think I do. An underrated part, well, not underrated, because a lot of people do sort of talk about it on Twitter, but if you're not like firmly in, like, sort of like follow some of the big like best ball guys like Josh ADHD and Beers and those guys, taking into account your exposure, sort of like we do in DFS, is also part of your best ball. If you're just going to put in $25 and draft one best ball team, you don't have to worry about it, obviously. But for me, like I think I'm approaching like 20 best ball drafts now, like heading into like my 19th or 20th. So I'm starting to think, like, the other day I was picking 6th, and I was like, I haven't picked Barkley in any drafts yet. Like, I want some exposure to him. So that definitely factors in. But I definitely do have my list, my sort of rankings. But it really, which position I actually end up taking at a given spot is really dictated a little bit more by the draft. If I'm anywhere between like 4 to 9, I'd say. Like, if I'm 10, 11, 12, I'm taking a wide receiver. But if I'm in those, if I'm in like that middle third of the draft, it really depends on what happens, right before me.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you find an edge at all between, like, is there any fish money per se, in like the 20? And it sounds weird too because it's a higher buy-in. But do you find some type of an edge in like the $25 best ball championship contest versus maybe a typical $10 or even just a typical $25 one that's not a part of the best ball championship? Like, do you find an edge there?
Yeah, I think that it's almost, again, not to like harp on DFS stuff, but I feel like people can, in a big tournament like that, can sort of fall into like the getting too cute category that we talk about a lot. There's a lot more, I would say, stacking. There's a lot more high variance strategies that are being taken in the best ball championship, where, I mean, you do have to take some shots, I guess, but I think that it's overstated. Like we talk about in golf, like you can win a GPP with a single digit, like 5% owned guy or 2 under 10% owned guys. It's the same sort of situation with the best ball championship. You obviously need to get lucky with injuries, and you do need to take a couple shots on some high variance guys and get lucky, but it doesn't mean that you have to go like completely off the board with all of your picks. Like, you should still like reasonably be following along with ADP. You shouldn't be reaching 3 rounds early for multiple guys. Get your guys, but I think that I've seen that more than anything else, like just guys going crazy and trying to have like a completely unique team and ending up hurting themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason to get crazy there. Now, going to the exposure part, right? Because you talked about exposure, especially when you have multiple best ball teams, because that's what a lot of these people have, right? Especially, if you're in the best ball championship, or if you just have a bunch of best ball contests throughout, right? Do you have, like, I know myself, for example, right? Like, I'll have in actual DFS football, I'll limit defenses for example, to 30%, right? I won't have 30% more or more than 30% of any one defense, right? Do you have those types of limits where you're like, where you look at a guy and say, I really don't want 85, 90, close to 100% of this particular player? Are you conscientious of that? And if you are, like, where's your limit on these guys?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that it's important to like, for me, at least, the way that I view it is, in the beginning of drafts, I'm trying to spread out my exposure a little bit. Like I said before, like, I needed to get a share of Barkley at some point, right? Like that, I like spreading out a little bit more up at the top, because you would have to think that the guys being drafted, the running backs being drafted in the first round are, have the highest likelihood of finishing at RB1 overall. Right. So I do want to spread out my exposure there. As I start to get down, I would say past like into like the 4th round and going down through like the middle rounds of drafts, I'm more than willing to have like 80% of a guy. I don't think it's reasonable or realistic to end up with 100% of somebody, just because there's going to be a draft where a guy gets pulled before you were willing to take him. But I would definitely. There's a few guys that I'm targeting in the middle, like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th rounds, that I'm more than happy to have on almost every team.
Okay. Yeah, so let's move on to later round strategy, right? Because we discussed early round strategy. You want your stud players, you want to prioritize wide receivers really in front of running backs, except if you're talking about the true studs. So let's talk about the middle rounds here, right? So what are you doing in the middle rounds of drafts when a lot of people are kind of stalling out, they're kind of fatigued, especially if you're in these longer contests, right? If you're in the 8-hour drafts, whatever, you kind of just want to get these things over with. But you want to, but we as, sharp drafters, if you will, kind of want to take advantage of that. So where are you going? Like, even after you draft your starters, like bench players, middle rounds of that draft.
Yeah. And even just to go to your point on that as well, like it's very interesting to hop into fast drafts on like a Friday, Saturday night when like people have obviously been drinking. and see like a 30-second timer getting in those fast drafts on draft is you see some very interesting decisions. So going back to like the edge question, like there's definitely an edge to be had there. Yeah. But as I like, again, depending on how I'm sort of putting my team together, like the one guy I constantly find myself drafting once we get out of like the first 4 rounds is Lamar Miller, like every single time. I don't really, I think it's sort of going around now, and I think his ADP is probably going to shoot up, but he's like on MFL 10s right now. He's being drafted at RB 26. Like that's outrageous. He was in the top like 15 last year, and he scored basically no touchdowns. Like if he has any sort of positive regression with touchdowns, he's a guy that's going to be, I would say he could finish at like RB 10, and he's being drafted outside the top 24 of running backs. So he's a guy that I've definitely been focused on. And I'm working on an article now that he's one of the guys that I'm definitely targeting. And Allen Hurns is another guy that's super, super late that you can get completely for free. And I don't really understand how, like, I think it's over 250 targets were vacated by the Cowboys because Witten retires, Dez gets cut. So there's all these targets floating around, right? Allen Hurns was more effective based on Blake Bortles' AYA to him than Allen Robinson was in the time that they were both there. And Allen Hurns is just completely free. Like he's wide receiver 50. Mm-hmm. That's insane to me. Like that's those two guys. If I end up with like 85, 90% of them, I will be perfectly happy in best ball.
Exactly. I mean, those targets have to go somewhere. And you know what pisses me off about Allen Hurns? His very first NFL game was against the Eagles when he was a Jaguar, and he puts up 3 touchdowns. Yep. Literally does nothing else after that. You know what he's going to do? You know what I can see happening? Like the Eagles will be like a game away from clinching the division or just clinching a first, whatever, right? And the Eagles would be going up against the Cowboys, and guess who's going to score 3 touchdowns again? Just to piss me off even more. I got this feeling that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And, oh my God. But, I mean, yeah, you know, to what you were saying, you know, in fantasy, skill is important, yes, but opportunities are very much more important.
Yeah.
Just because even Allen Hurns, who's really not that good, is going to get quite a few targets in an offense where he has no competition.
Right. Like who else? Yeah. They're throwing Cole Beasley. Like even if Cole Beasley gets his share of targets, it's like where else are they going with the ball? Like obviously they're going to run quite a bit, but I don't see how he doesn't outperform wide receiver 50. And like you mentioned, he can score touchdowns at, you know, if you're getting him for free in best ball, you don't have to figure out when to start him. Yeah. He's going to be in your lineup when he has those big games. So I don't really see the downside to that, to picking Hurns at his current price.
No, it's he's something else though. I'll tell you that much. Yeah, I mean we're getting into that range, right? Sleepers. Do you have? I mean, how many? Just name off some guys that you think are going to be real deep sleepers. Because I have one who I don't think anyone's thinking about, and I think you really have to be tuned into some lower levels of football to be tuned into this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of alluded to before. Once you get past, I don't know, at least for me, once I'm past like, I think it's probably Fournette. So, you know, you have like the big 4, and then you have Kamara, Barkley, Hunt, Gordon, and Fournette. Like those guys, I feel incredibly confident in that their workload is secure, that they're going to perform as long as they're healthy, right? Like I know that all of those things are probably going to be true. Once I get past there, there's sort of a tier that I could see finishing kind of anywhere. Like I love Lamar Miller, but if he was RB23 at the end of the season, it wouldn't shock me, right? So as I'm going through, I'm looking for those pass catching backs, like I mentioned before, and I'm looking for some like running backfields that are still sort of up in the air. So I might be looking towards like Indy right now and getting some exposure to Johnson and Mack. I'll definitely have some Duke Johnson, even though I don't really know how that shakes out. But I think they'll figure out a way to get him the ball. I don't know. As far as running backs go, like you can take some shots at the New England running backs as well. Because again, in best ball, you don't have to decide when to start these guys. So though that random game that Sony Michel has 3 touchdowns, you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
So that's at least running back wise. I'm looking for targets when I'm in like the middle to late rounds. So any pass catching back is probably going to find their way onto a couple of my rosters.
Yeah. So 2 things, right? To the Lamar Miller comment, I'm just trying to figure some things out. All right, yeah. So the Lamar Miller comment, the Texans, I get it, right? Lamar Miller is a talented guy, but the Texans have the worst offensive line in football. I mean, I pray for Deshaun Watson because I think he's going to get hurt again. Just given his his style of play, his awful offensive line that kind of got improved. You have Martinez Rankin, I think it is, at right tackle, who they just picked up through the draft. He's the only improvement. So God only knows what's going to happen there. But the sleeper that I'm thinking about here that you could probably get, in best ball, he'll probably not get drafted, right? And then in traditional season-long fantasy football, he'll be a free agent, I guarantee you. Brandon Zylstra. Do you even know what team he plays for?
I have no idea who that is.
And do you know what team he played for last year?
I have no idea. He's not even in like the draft, like the best ball ADP. So
I know this is just a season-long fantasy comment because this kind of all ties in together. But the Minnesota Vikings made a very strong pickup in January. In that little, that weird period of time in January where they can sign like conditional contracts or whatever.
Yeah.
He was one of those. You know who he played for last season?
If it's a Canadian team, I'm logging off.
Get that log off button ready because Edmonton Eskimos.
I was like, I have never heard of this guy. There's a 0% chance that he was in the NFL last year.
No, I don't think he even tried out for an NFL team before. But yeah, Brandon Zylstra was the #1 wide receiver in terms of yardage in the Canadian Football League last year.
Is he like the Lucas Glover of the NFL this year?
I mean, for those that don't understand the golf context here, I talk about Lucas Glover a lot when we talk golf. So. But no,
that's a hell of a shot to call there. That's an interesting hill to die on. I would love if it worked out for you though.
I am the only not even the CFL guys agree with me on this.
People will be listening to this podcast for all eternity if you got this call right. So
I keep telling my fantasy circles, if you don't have Brandon Zylstra on your post draft free agent radar, you're not doing it right. God. I will. You know what? I'm going to write this down. I have to draft Brandon Zylstra in my season-long fantasy teams. Because that's just the hill I'm willing to die on.
There you go.
All right. I think that'll do it for us. I think we got a good amount of best ball content in here. Again, hoping you guys, learned a little bit more about best ball through this podcast again, through a much more knowledgeable source on the topic than myself and Matt. So Matt, thank you for being on the show with me. It was much appreciated.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
And of course, if I'm not winning all that best ball money, I hope you guys do. So have fun with your best ball drafts. Hope you guys can make some money there. Peace out.